Welcome everybody to a tier list video. These are always fun because the onerous isn't always just on me. And this time we have a great individual joining us, somebody that I've been following for pretty much as long as I've been here. I don't know who actually got their start on YouTube first. I want to say you were on the scene maybe a year and a half before I was.
I was 2013.
Okay, I was the summer of 2014. So yeah, it's about an hour and a bit. And I've been following your work pretty much since the beginning, loving your ideas. And unlike a lot of our contemporaries who always feel like we have to stay in one lane in musical genres and expressions, I am a huge proponent. Like I have done that to a fault, being in the prog rock side of things. You seem to cover everything. So do you want to introduce yourself? Let everybody know who you are.
Sure. Hey, folks, my name is Mark. I'm the host of Spectrum Pulse. I talk about music, movies, art, and culture. My general purview has been covering really any genre. A lot of that usually crossed my radar. I've got some toes in more of the prog rock and prog metal scene, not as deeply as I'd say I used to be. Nowadays, it's all sorts of eccentric and weird shit. But also, in terms of my regular series, I should have a series called On the Pulse, where I compile a number of different albums together, where I talk about them en masse. I'll do my solo album reviews. I have my side channel where I talk about Billboard Breakdown, where I go in at length at the inanities and insanities of the Hot 100. Really, so much. Yeah. And outside of that, just other extraneous video essays and other topics that might otherwise be on my radar. So I'm actually happy that we're collaborating for this and potentially more down the line.
I hope so. Yeah, because I think slowly progressive rock is clawing its way out of obscurity from the 70s with artists like Steven Wilson, even though I know he's not a fan of the progressive rock moniker. He's kind of raged against it for a little bit.
Yeah, I get why.
Yeah, and I understand why. You know, there is a history when it comes to progressive rock, especially within the mainstream. But one of the, I guess, more modern takes for progressive rock, whether or not he likes it, is Porcupine Tree. And I know you're one of the few other YouTubers more in the know that follows Porcupine Tree. So I'd love to know how you got into them and how you got introduced to them.
I kind of got into them near the end of their run, funnily enough. So this was, I want to say, mid 2000s. I was really branching out into a lot of metal around that time. I started, hey, there's this prog metal stuff. I'm interested in this, and I don't mind progressive rock. So I'm going to venture in. My first album was Blackest Eyes. And then from there, I actually went backwards before going forwards. So I actually went back and I found Up the Downstairs, Lightbulb Sun, a lot of those albums. I got into, then around that time, Fear of a Blank Planet came out. I got into that. I got into the instant afterwards. Deadwing was a big dead spot for me for a long time, and we'll get into why that is a little later on. Overall, it's been kind of a sprawling sort of thing, where I bounced around a lot. And I'll admit, some gaps in my back catalog where in the process of prepping for this review, I had actually gone back and listened to albums that I may have only heard once or twice before, just they never wound up in my regular rotation.
Yeah, mine is similar, although the timeline is a bit further on. Probably around 2007, 2008, right when Blank Planet came out. I was doing a deep dive into anything new on the prog sphere. And this was when Blank Planet was like really making a stand, and everybody was like dying over themselves. And I had just moved out of my like childhood home, so I picked up Fear and Deadwing at the same time. Listened to those like constantly, and then from there, much like you, I went back to actually The Sky Moves Sideways and Signify.
Okay.
Yeah, and then got into those. And much like you, was very piecemeal. Like every once in a while, I'd listen to a new one, get into that, move on to another one, and just kind of bounced around. And then after I had pretty much digested the whole discography, that's when The Incident came out. So
that helps.
It was a perfect time for me to get like until very recently, the last thing that Porcupine Tree would do. So
What I find interesting, at least when it comes to a lot of prog metal discussing, well, prog rock, prog metal with Porcupine Tree, at least for me, I've had very serious ups and downs with them. And I think a lot of it's tied into Steven Wilson himself as a frontman, depending on how much he annoys me at any specific point.
That's fair. Yeah.
So when he went and did his solo run with Insurgents and Grace for Drowning, both of which I just think are insufferable albums.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And coming like the Raven That Refused to Sing, it nearly won me back, but then I got one back in a big way with Hand Cannot Erase.
Yeah.
And I think that's left me a little kinder on this. Even if I will admit, coming off of The Future Bites, I kind of slipped back into the downstream again. So I might be more critical.
That's okay. I have a very similar experience with Porcupine Tree and with Steven Wilson. Like Insurgents, for me, it just missed the mark. I didn't get it. Grace for Drowning, I thought, was a fantastic piece, but how it fit in with what he and Michael Eckefelt was doing at the time, with Storm Corrosion and with Heritage, that all kind of came out in the same time frame. I liked how like they all kind of tied together very, very loosely. The biggest caveat that I always had with Steven Wilson is sticking the landing for a concept, because he's never really, I felt, mastered how to handle that, and it always kind of unravels by the end. But I know we're going to get into that a little bit more.
Absolutely, for sure.
And speaking of, let's go right. Oh, I guess before we do that, this is just their studio releases of Porcupine Tree. I know a lot of people can, argue what and what isn't. We made the decision to only include, there was a little bit of a discussion in terms of should Voyage 34 and you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation because Metanoia, whether they deserved here, whereas other ones might not, like recordings and things like that. I figured because they are unique songs that aren't tied to a specific album, they deserve to be their own studio release, whereas all the other ones are either EPs or compilations or reworkings. So there you go. If anybody disagrees, let me know in the comments and I will ignore. So let's go to their first album, which is On the Sunday of Life.
Yes.
If you want to take the lead, what do you think about this album?
Okay, so a few things that I want to highlight with this is that it's not technically a traditionally structured album because it's built off of two old cassette-only releases that he had put out back in, I want to say, the late 80s, very early 90s. Yeah. So immediately you're dealing with something that feels more like a compilation that's kind of been mushed together in order to compose itself. As such, it's also way too long. It is one of those—
my biggest criticism.
Yep, it's one of those projects where I feel like it's very much Porcupine Tree at its infancy. This was Steven Wilson predominantly handling the majority of work himself, majority of instruments himself, which I will highlight him as a virtuoso in a number of points here, but this is arguably where the most rough edges are showing through. And I think that's kind of what throws me on this outside of a few specific tracks. And I think it ends remarkably well.
Yeah, I fully agree. The biggest weakness of this is that it is way too long, and it does feel like two EPs that have just been shoved together, like two almost full-length albums that have been shoved together, because it is very like disjointed as well. Like it doesn't provide a very satisfying start to finish listen. Now that being said, I think this has some of the most quirky moments that I unfortunately wish— It's like I love Jupiter Planet, and I love Nine Cats, and I really wish this more strange and quirky aspect of Steven Wilson continued on, but I feel like he would probably label it as immature, but I just think it's fun.
On the flip side, though, the one thing that I will actually give him a little bit of credit on with this is that I went back to listen to those two cassettes that have been adapted, and I think they've been uploaded to YouTube in some form, and I've actually gone through them. The stuff he should have cut for good reason. There's a lot of, for lack of better words, edgelord shit on this project, which is understandable for Steven Wilson as a debut album and as a pretty young guy. Like he was in his early to mid 20s when this came out, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, you know what? I get it. It feels like it would play better to an audience nowadays rather than a critical set who has the full knowledge of what Steven Wilson would come to do. And one thing I also want to highlight here is that whenever I went back through the majority of these re-listens, which I re-listened to the entire catalog before sitting down for this, I could only find remasters for some of these.
Yeah.
You can tell this was a remaster that required a lot of work. There's a very distinctive buttery feel over the entire project where you can tell that some rough edge textures were getting smoothed over. I especially think that the vocals are rough on this album. Yeah. And again, Steven Wilson's never been a great singer, and I will consistently, I think he's got his moments, he's got his range. This is not a good showcase for him.
No, like some of those falsettos and some of those weird effects that he was putting on to try to make up for what he was lacking. Again, I think it's kind of quirky, but it doesn't make for a great listen from start to finish.
I would agree.
So I'm thinking anywhere between a D and a C for me for this one. Like, it's not quite a complete failure because, again, I love the Jupiter track and I love Nine Tails. Radioactive Toy is one that they still consistently play too.
Yeah.
So, like, I can't completely say that's a complete write-off, but yeah, this is kind of like the bottom of the barrel for me.
I kind of agree. I would be comfortable putting this in the D tier.
Yeah. So we got our first initiative, only up from here.
Yeah, yes and no.
Yes and no. And so speaking of, we're going up the downstairs.
Yep.
With the follow-up.
Now, a couple things about this. I think this is Steven on CD.
Oh, props, perfect.
This is one I bought back in the mid 2000s when I was getting into the band. It's, I will say this, the leap that Steven Wilson took with this project, it gives me the impression that he intended this as the proper debut, and that's kind of how I treat it.
I could see that for sure. Yeah, because like the leap in quality and also the leap in focus is huge. Like, it's no longer just a collection of tracks that were lying around. It was no longer like it provides a great unified listen to. I do think that, and I mean, Steven was always criticized for this in the early days of leaning too heavily on some of his influences like David Gilmour and whatnot. Kind of shows a little bit on here, but I don't think he leans quite as hard as a lot of proggers that would later come. Yeah.
You can still tell that he's trying to find his footing with this album. Now, the one thing I'll give this album a lot of credit before I will go into the next two is that this is probably one of the earlier slices that feels very song focused. Like Synesthesia really pops off, especially. And there's moments with this specific album that I feel actually kind of would hold up a decent bit in comparison with other cuts in the catalog. I feel like the production, again, going on in comparison with the CD to the remaster, it's one of those that required a little less work. That there's still touch-ups, it's still more buttery than I would prefer, but overall there's a little more spice to it, a little bit more crunch to it. I do think the guitars in this era of Porcupine Tree don't sound the best, but that's a matter of just growing with time. But overall, this was the one I think is the first really solid hit that they get from me.
Yeah, and I agree to that. In terms of like a full-on album, now I always say that like, again, those quirky tracks from the Sunday of Life I like more than anything that's on this one, but I would rather listen to this from start to finish.
Yes,
easily. And I like the more of like the orchestration and like composition of songs here. There's a lot more, as I already mentioned, forethought into what it's going to sound like.
It doesn't meander in the same way that the debut did.
Correct. And it doesn't meander the same way that other tracks later on will as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this one for me is like a solid B.
I lean a little more towards an A because I've got that old nostalgia to it, but I'm okay with putting it in the B tier.
Okay. Yeah. Again, this is a collaborative. It's where we all where we both feel comfortable with. Although if you do feel strongly enough, I am always up to being persuaded.
We will encounter that later.
I'm sure we will. It might be this one. This is the big follow-up. I know for this, this was the one from my recollection that really made headway for like prog spheres. Like Up the Downstairs was the one that got people kind of interested. This was the one that made people pay attention.
I would agree. The one thing that I like the Up the Downstairs because it kind of feels still nestled in its own universe, and some of the lyrics do translate to that. Because again, the one thing I don't want to push this too hard, but there's a bit of an incel edge that comes across in Up the Downstairs just a bit.
Yeah, and there is, and we'll get to it in a little bit later, but that's something that has been seen a little bit further along the catalogs as well, that upon re-listening, I was just like, oh, this has not aged as well as I was hoping it would.
Now, I don't think this album has the same problem. I think this album is a lot more spacey and relaxed, definitely leaning on the much harder the psychedelic side. And that's one thing I don't think Steven Wilson gets enough credit for in this era. A lot of people, we'll get to this later on, but a lot of people want to make the parallel with Steven Wilson and Porcupine Tree with Radiohead. And I fundamentally disagree with this, and we'll get to a number of points as to why. But the big thing for me is that Steven Wilson always came from prog from a very psychedelic vantage point. Absolutely. That a lot of his song structures are more meandering, they're more spacious, it's more focused on the ambiance and the atmosphere. It's why he had so much of his ambient side projects that cascaded into this. This album in particular has that psychedelic flair that allows it to be more relaxed. And I'll admit, this is where I kind of fall off it a little bit because it's a little too relaxed.
Right. And I mean, when they were first being cataloged on all these different prog websites, they were constantly being put into the psychedelic space rock. It's only more recently that they've moved over into the heavy, hard rock side of things because they have transitioned into that. But this is more of like my favorite expression of Porcupine Tree and Steven Wilson's work. I will agree with you in that I think this does meander ever so slightly. And it also kind of depends on what cut you're listening to for this, because the remastered version is very different than the original. Yeah. And I'm still on the fence which version I prefer. Like, obviously I prefer the original, but you know, that deep cut of the 30-minute just Sky Moves Sideways suite, I like, but it's kind of incomplete without that final movement in my mind.
I would agree with you. I feel like this is one of those albums that really could afford a moment to actually get cut together in an effective way. Like it sprawls in lumpy spots, and it doesn't lead to it feeling as well paced as it should, even if I think a lot of the individual song moments and the melodic compositions really shine here.
Like I love you know, the whole Sky Moves Sideways piece, even if at points I'm like, okay, this the album that I think this mirrors very much is like a Pink Floyd's Obscured by Clouds, where there's so many moments on Obscured by Clouds that I love, but the mixing and the choice of how to orchestrate it kind of brings the actual enjoyment down for me. That's kind of where I'm at for this one. Now, I have very positive memories of listening to this and really diving into it. So I'm going to do my best not to let that sway me. But yeah, so for me, because I'm kind of in two camps with this one can either go to an A or a B. I don't want to put it any higher than like an A because it definitely doesn't fit there at all. But I wouldn't want to put it any lower than like a C. So kind of where I'm sitting with it.
For me, it's more of a C in my point of view, but I also am. I think with the right edit of this album, and depending on whether or not you have the original versus the remaster, and again, this is one I could really only find a good version of the remaster, which goes much longer and feels a little bit more uneven in spots, I'd be inclined to put this at a B.
Okay. Well, we'll put it into a B because I agree with all that. I think if they had mixed this better, this could have very easily have been an A.
Yes.
But also, if they had just presented one mix or another, then it could have been like a C in that case. So yeah, I'm kind of in a B. Now this one, the next one of Signify, I have this is still the one that I have the most difficult time with of all the albums. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's one of the albums that I've listened to the most. Like right after I got into Fear and Deadwing, this was the next album from them that I picked up. Um, like I love the final track, and I love how most of the tracks basically lead up to Dark Matters. It's one of my all-time favorite tracks from them.
Yep.
I love the build. I love the build-ups. I feel as though this is one of the first instances where Steven Wilson is starting to realize Porcupine as a band rather than just another side project of his.
Absolutely agree with that for sure.
Yeah. The songs are getting tighter. They're getting punchier. And I think part of that is me seeing this as not really them knowing where to go with this. It's like they're getting punchier, they're getting stronger, but they don't know quite what to do. And because of that, some of the more punchy songs don't work as well for me as some of the punchier songs from Up This Downstairs or The Sky Moves Sideways.
That's interesting because I kind of, you could definitely tell it's a transitional album. I agree with you there. But this was often when I've often seen this album discussed alongside with Up the Downstairs and The Sky Moves Sideways, this is often considered as the completion of a trilogy of their psychedelic era. Yeah. The interesting thing with this is that it's probably their darkest early album.
It is.
And sure. it tilts a lot more into, I wouldn't say metal textures, it wouldn't get there yet, but a lot more dark ambient and there's a lot more electronic touches on this album. And I think they've aged amazingly well. I think, again, this is one of those albums where I think the production really shines. I think it's better paced than the previous two albums. This is a project that I actually was caught off guard how much I wound up enjoying it. It's a great mood wallowing album, but not one that drags to the point where it can get insufferable, at least for me.
Okay, no, that's fair. Yeah, and I also enjoy how this is one of the first ones where they're really starting to play with concepts and themes in terms of like lyrics and content. Yep. We have a lot more of the spoken word on here. A lot of it deals with religion and spirituality and like where those differ and where those are the same. Yeah, so I don't know. Every time I listen to this, I always feel something very different. And I mean, that's also to say that it's good art because I'm getting different feelings each time, but I still don't quite know what to make of it. So that's why I have such a hard time with it.
That's fair. And the one thing I will say is that this is an album I think has only grown on me because I have embraced a lot more ambient music within the course of the past year, 2 years. That's a genre I've really gotten into a lot more. And this is an album I think really showcases that whole electronic tendency very effectively. Now, I'm not going to say it's, for me, I have a hard time putting it in the tier of their best. But it's one that I will absolutely stick up for, and I think it gets a little underrated.
Okay, so where would you think that this would land?
For me, it's probably an A, but I know more often for not, it's probably go to a B.
Right, and I also don't want to clutter up the B section, but I feel once we start going further into their discography, it's going to start splitting up a little bit more.
I would agree.
But I will also agree, like looking at the albums that we have in the B, I think that this fits very, very well with those other two albums.
I also want to highlight that, again, like when it comes for Steven Wilson and Porcupine Tree albums, it's very difficult for me to say that any of these are bad. Like
these are
like a B for a Porcupine Tree is going to be an S tier for some artist.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's always a caveat that I always say is like, even though these are very general in terms of music overall, at the end of the day, we are kind of mainly looking across the discography itself and kind of rating in and amongst themselves. Yeah. So now we come to an album, and I'm very interested to hear what you think about this one, because this is one that I was really, really into when I was doing my undergrad and my final couple of years in my undergrad up in Sudbury. So I have some pretty vivid memories of being in like the basement of the biology lab, just spending countless hours running numbers. But I am curious, what do you think about Stupid Dream?
Stupid Dream for me has a weird history because I heard all the backlash to this album before I heard it directly. Because this was an album that was the first one that I would say breaks them out of the psychedelic scene and the prog scene. This started getting them, I'm not going to say mainstream attention because Porcupine Tree have never been a mainstream act, but it got them enough attention from the critical set and indie spheres. It started drawing a lot of comparisons. And this is, again, I have to stress, this is pre-internet. So a lot of them did not have the familiarity with Porcupine Tree's back catalog. And since they were predominantly on an independent label, excuse me, they didn't have the same level of distribution.
Yeah.
So, which has also made, I would argue it's made collecting and fully appreciating Porcupine Tree's catalog a lot more difficult in the 90s era than it is today, where it's all on Tidal or wherever.
Yeah.
This album caught me off guard because of how happy it is.
Maybe that's why I personally like it so much, because I prefer happy music over dark music. But it is, yeah, it is very, with a lot of the different themes that are present on this album, the actual music and a lot of the lyrics are quite optimistic and happy, which you don't think of when you think of Steven Wilson.
Not at all. And the thing I kind of like is that it ties into the whole idea of the stupid dream, where he might have been disaffected before when it comes to love, relationships, acceptance, and that sort of thing. And it's like, it's a stupid dream, but is it?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like dreams can still be pleasant, even if they're, not real,
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And the one thing I will say is that it's bitter. It's with this specific era of Porcupine Tree, where it's more song focused, I think this is probably one of their most hit and miss albums for me. I think it's got some very steep up and downs. And there's some moments I'm like, okay, this is very late 90s, which is like, it was poppy. I'm like, if you, in the right environment in 97, if you put this on an alternative radio station, this could have worked. And it makes me laugh.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just so many, like, really, you kind of have to scratch your head and be like, okay, that's very interesting. Yeah. Like, so I was presented with a lot of these tracks from a live album that I found at the time. So like even less I had already heard of. Don't Hate Me, I'd already heard of. I do like that, even though they're going really hard into that singer songwriter, very like short, punchy tracks, we still have a lot of those like dipping of toes into their past with tracks like Don't Hate Me or Tinto Brass that are still very experimental and whatnot. But for me, even though as optimistic as a lot of these tracks are, like Stranger by the Minute and like A Smart Kid and all that, the ending piece of Stop Swimming just is heart-wrenching, because
it's beautiful too.
Oh yeah, depending on how you want to like interpret it, it's like, yeah, I'm done. Like, and this is something that Steven would, he would play with a little bit more, but I think he really found it on this one.
I would agree. Again, this got savaged by critics at the time.
Yeah, which I could understand.
I get why it ties into a lot of the Radioheadisms that were, this album got compared to OK Computer a lot, which I don't think is fair. OK Computer, I'd argue, is Radiohead's second best album. And I think this is not peak Porcupine Tree for me. And I think I'll say this, I think there can be an emotional simplicity to this project that is both a good strength, but also a weakness.
Yeah, because part of the thing that I did love about Porcupine Tree later and earlier is they're playing with simplicity and complexity and how they interweave. Whereas this doesn't really play with either of those. It's just very straightforward in that sense. And it's so interesting, depending on the day, in terms of actually putting this in the tier, this could land anywhere between an A or a C.
I would agree. For me, I'm closer to a B with this.
Okay. And I feel okay with that. Again, because I could, one day I'll listen to it and I'm like, this is my jam. I want nothing else. Other days I'm like, nope, I am not in the right headspace for this at all. So this, oh boy, this one is fun.
It is fun.
It is fun. So I'm saying it is the complete trip, phases 1, 2, 3, and 4. Voyage 34. I remember listening to, again, it was on that same live CD, and it was the Live from Warsaw that they had. And they ended the show with Voyage 34, I think phase 1 or 2. As much
Makes
as I
sense.
love, as much as I love Voyage 34 and having some of my favorite Porcupine Tree music, the first phase and the second phase are indistinguishable. They're practically the same. And phase 4 and 3 are, I
Bleak.
don't, very unique. That is a good way to put it.
I didn't say unique. I said bleak.
Oh, I heard unique. Both are very correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's one of those like art pieces where it's not all that pleasant to listen to, but like what they're doing with music to enunciate and like put to music this experience, it's very interesting.
This is one of those projects, just to provide a little context for those who might be less familiar with this, because this is an obscure entry in Porcupine Tree's catalog. This is a 4-part series of extended instrumental clips peppered in with some spoken word segments that were actually pulled from anti-drug PSAs in order to highlight, because this is the point where you could tell Porcupine Tree at some point decided, we did a lot of LSD, let's make an album about it. And on some level, that can be really cool. There's a focus on groove on this album, especially in the first 2 movements, that's really, really potent. I actually kind of really like the 4th movement.
Interesting. Okay.
It's bleak, but again, it leads into a lot of ambient textures, which I really like. And I like how it takes a lot of the old scare terminology surrounding psychedelics and then moves it to a modern context, which is very societally charged. We'll see a lot of that come up later with Porcupine Tree's catalog, but this was the first point I'm sitting there and I'm like, as much as there's very much of a makes you think like element to Porcupine Tree, that's kind of something you have to learn to live with this band.
Yeah.
Overall, I think it drags and it's a little heavy-handed, but it's not one I will go back to that often. I think it's less essential, but there's parts I really like.
I'm in the exact same boat. Like there are moments on this that I will just listen to. Like I'll listen to just phase 1 or just phase 2. If the moment strikes, I'll dip my toes into 3 and 4, but like I'll go back to those, but as like a full album, I very, very rarely touch this thing.
Yeah. At the same time, I also think this is an album that would probably work better with a visual component.
Absolutely.
Or a plant component.
Unfortunately, I'm a teetotaler or a teetoddler, so I don't do any of that, but I could only imagine. I could see this working really well in like the old Windows like movie media player and just watching that. And I feel like listening to this live would be really good, or at least like one of the sections. I wouldn't want to listen to the whole thing live. I would feel okay putting this in the C category again.
Absolutely. It's a C tier album.
As an album, rather than like the specific songs that are found on here.
Yeah, as an album, I think it's fine, but again, I'm not going to go back to it much.
Yeah, exactly.
On the flip side.
Yes, I know. And I think this might be one of the albums where we have a little bit of a discussion on, because I know a lot of people love this album. I have mine way in my other room there. This for me, and I might be castrated, I might be hung out to dry. For me, this album is a mixed grab bag of tracks. And it's so interesting because I actually prefer the more somber singer-songwriter tracks on this than I do the bigger, more proggier pieces on this. Outside of maybe Rush on Ice or Last Chance to Leave Planet Earth Before It's Recycled, I have to be kind of in the right mood for that. But I've never warmed up to Hate Song, never really enjoyed it. And I know I'm getting, and I get it. For me, like, okay, or not, I almost called it Okay Computer. Stupid Dream is a kind of a start to finish, even though there's variations on it, like a complete work. This one feels like the continuation of that style, that sound, but I don't know, they perfected certain things, but then didn't know what to do with others. So that's kind of where I'm at with Light Bulb Sun. It's not my favorite of theirs, and it's I'm very interested to hear yours because I have a feeling you look on this a little more fondly than I do.
This is my favorite Porcupine Tree album.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's a couple things I want to highlight with this album specifically. For me, I think nearly every single track fits within the larger context of the album, where there's a very potent environmentalist theme, but you can also tell that's kind of a backdrop to the heartbreak. And it's a breakup album fundamentally, but it's also a breakup album fused with a weird environmentalist narrative. And I think it meshes together a lot better than I think a lot of people expect, because it's got some of those dazed kind of drifting elements, like How Is Your Life Today? There's a very distinctive British sentiment that comes through a lot of elements on this album, where it's very reserved in how it presents itself until it boils over and explodes in some of the nastier moments. A big example for that for me is Hate Song, which I think is just so well primed in terms of that slow build and seething intensity that it comes up with. She's Moved On is, my opinion, one of the Porcupine Tree's best ever songs.
I will agree to that. Yeah.
Just because it's got that weird off-kilter twang to it, but then it resolves into something that is a lot more lush and vibrant, and the vocal harmonies are so good. One other thing I want to highlight with this project, and I think this is where I tend to really love this project and what comes next, Chris Maitland's drumming is so good.
Yeah,
so good.
It's a shame that he always gets overshadowed by Gavin, who came to replace him. And Gavin is like one of the greatest drummers currently working in the prog sphere, but like, yeah, he doesn't quite get the same recognition, or I guess he gets too much, not too much, but there's always this shadow that, oh yeah, we forget that there were other drummers in Porcupine Tree.
Yeah, and I think it's totally unfair because I like Chris Maitland's drumming a lot more. I think that he's got a much better command of dynamics. And the big thing with a lot of Porcupine Tree albums is that the sense of dynamics is so important. And and I want to highlight that specifically because of all the old albums that I went back and checked on streaming services to check if they were remastered, this one was not.
Yeah.
This one, they haven't touched this one. That to me says a lot, because I think the production on this album is gorgeous, just in terms of how crisp it is, how much they experimented with other instruments and experimentation in order to flesh out a more lush and textured sound, but also one that's a little off kilter and weird. It's not as dark as Porcupine Tree would get on later projects, but the melancholia, I think, is a lot better balanced. And I'll say this, it's probably the album that feels the most mature coming out from this band, especially lyrically.
I would agree. And I think that, I mean, as much as I'm not a big fan of this album, the one thing I will at least give massive credit to is the balance between the light and the dark on this. I don't think any other album has balanced it quite as well, especially with some of the, like, my favorite tracks on here are like The Restful Flow and Where We Would Be. And being so beautiful, I can like very vividly picture, like a picnic on the countryside with some of these, which is something that you could never say with a lot of their even before or after moments. But then blending that with some of the very darker tracks, like again, Rush on Ice or Last Chance to Leave Planet Earth. And I think this is one of the first instances where I think maybe Steven Wilson's cynicism of the record industry starts to really bleed through with like
4 chords to make a million.
4 chords to make a million. Yeah.
Which is a song I'll admit freely took a while to grow on me, because it came across as so bitter. It came across as so sardonic in terms of the rest of the album. But I'm also like, it is kind of valid, especially when in the context of the larger album, where in terms of how much of the album is about the breakup and the environmentalist narrative, it is the first point where that caustic element makes a lot of sense, because like, you're expecting me to commodify my art and the pain I'm going through and the larger agony of the environment collapsing. I think that's aged kind of really well.
It has. Yeah. And it's almost like you keep now that you've primed my thinker about like this breakup album with environmentalism, it's almost like the human race is broken up with the planet Earth.
Yep.
In that sense, where it's like, well, we're just not going to hold it anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I could understand and I'd be okay putting this in the A category because I have a feeling you want to put this in the S category.
I do.
I don't know if I could go all the way to an S because for me, this is more in like the B or C territory. But there are, as I mentioned, there are moments on here, especially with Feel Solo and all those other ones. I would feel okay putting this in the A category, but I want to also make sure that you feel all right with that.
We can put it in the A category. I understand. Because again, I don't like as much as I will say that I adore this album, it's not a good jump on point for Porcupine Tree at all.
I would, yes, because like, so right after I listened to Stupid Dream, I went to, well, actually I went to In Absentia after that, but then later on I went to Light Bulb Sun and I'm like, I don't know, just didn't quite do it for me. But I mean, I have grown warmer to this album.
Yeah.
And I will say it is nowhere near their worst, but I think I agree that it's not a good jumping on point for anybody that has no idea what Porcupine Tree is.
And this is where I would also highlight, this is one of those albums that also gets a lot of the Radiohead comparisons, whatever.
Yeah. And honestly, I had heard about that, but I still don't see it. Like I can see a little bit, but like there were a lot of British and UK acts around that time that just sounded similar. And not to say that they were,
you're right,
but like I could like the same argument was made with Muse, the same argument was made with Elbow. But I think it was just these were bands that were coming out of the same area in the same time, and they just, it's kind of like animals that just happen to look and act similarly, but they're very different beasts.
I would agree with you there. I'd also say a lot of this again is pre-internet, where there wasn't as much as sites were starting to pop up around that time, and the internet becomes a theme across some of Stephen Wilson's later material. We'll get to it.
Yep.
But I think the one thing that will highlight this is that this was the first one where even the people who were making a lot of the dismissive Radiohead comparisons with Stupid Dream, they come to Light Bulb 7 and they're like, okay, even if we don't love it, it's really beautiful, we'll tolerate it.
Right, yeah, and that's fair. So now we come into another album, and I would listen to this one when I first heard it falling asleep, because it is very ambient, it is very impressionistic, and I think I still have, I have all of my Porcupine Tree CDs over there. Oh, interesting. Here, yours is, let's see, do I still have it voiced?
This was the 2007 reissue.
Okay, yeah, because there's Warsaw.
Because this is the one that K-Scope eventually reissued. So.
Right. Oh, I don't think I have it with me, because the one that I have this is the live CD I have. It came like this, where it was like a paper.
Got you.
Paper doer. Yeah, so this is another one where people argue whether or not it's a full length like studio record from them.
Counts.
But for me, it definitely counts. I could see the argument because unlike a lot of their other works, it is a lot more impressionistic. It's a lot more ambient. I do feel as though it's kind of working a lot with demos and ideas without anything actually being fully flushed out in that sense, in terms of like an actual album. But I still love a lot of the movements and a lot of the music that's found on it.
I love this thing. Full disclosure, this is one I was expecting to have to fight with anyone about this, because I think this album is absolutely stunning. I think this is a project that again gets slept on a lot, especially as it's predominantly instrumental, peppered with a couple of like vocal snippets in between. But it's so well paced. The drumming is so good. Like this is Chris Maitland, in my opinion, at his best. I think that in terms of the where Voyage 34 was very groove centric, very locked into its repetitive momentums, this is a lot more, I'd almost say jazz inspired, especially when it came to its melodic movements. It flows a lot more effectively. It is, again, impressionistic. It's got very much of an ambient attitude, but I like that. So it's the sort of thing where it kind of fits that very dreamy vibe. It's not going to be the sort of thing that you put on and you will get immediately. And I'll freely admit that this took a while for me to actually click with. But now that I've clicked with it, I think it's probably the most slept on album in their canon.
I would agree to that. Like, definitely this one gets overlooked the most and without too much merit either. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know, like, at least within my, sway within the prog sphere, I see a lot more people talking about Voyage 34 and Voyage 34 getting a lot more love and reissues, because I believe Voyage 34, well, they reissued their album as a full vinyl release, but this
Oh,
one's never, at least from my understanding, this one's never seen a vinyl reissue, or if they have, I haven't seen it.
I haven't either. I'd love to get this on vinyl. It sounded amazing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and the thing that kind of elevates this beyond just a regular like EP or special edition or something like that, outside of the runtime, and outside of the fact that it's not tied to any other album of theirs, is the unification of the theme, never straying away from it. And I do feel as though thematically, this is Porcupine Tree's one of their stronger works thematically.
Yep, I would agree. Totally.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why I will actually go back to it as often as I do, because again, it does feel like one of the most cohesive pieces of music.
Yes.
And it's also one of those where it did get a remaster, but not one that feels overpowering, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah, because I do know, Steven Wilson loves to remaster and remix a lot of things. This one doesn't have, that big thumbprint where he's just doing things to do things.
I agree.
Yeah. So for me, at least with my enjoyment, this is like top tier. This is like A for me.
A, absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah. Perfect.
Now, I think that's going to be surprising to some longtime. It'll be interesting to see the Porcupine Tree fans who will argue with this one.
Well, that's it. Like, I feel like they don't really have too much to, well, I say this, but I know that they're going to have a backlash, but like, I feel like they don't really have too much of a leg to stand on to try. Like, I would love to see them try. I honestly would.
Yeah. I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. This I know is in some people's mind, the big magnum opus. This is their big, big one. I always mispronounce this. For the longest time, I was calling it in absentia or in absentia. I have a full document of people trying to correct my pronunciation of this because I couldn't. I believe it is in absentia.
Yeah, I believe in absentia or whatever. Either way, this is the pivot album for Porcupine Tree. This is where they got rid of Chris Maitland. They brought in Gavin. This is the first time they went metal. And then they got all the Tool comparisons, and I just get really angry.
Yeah, like, okay. So, yeah, this was circa era 2002. So,
yes,
Steven Wilson was just off the heels of Blackwater Park, helping Michael Eckefelt from Opeth master and mix and produce that album. And the two of them created one of prog's biggest bromances. So I'm not surprised that they went metal. I'm actually surprised that they didn't go more into the metal sphere with this album, especially off of the heels of kind of the momentum that they had with Lightbulb Sun, with some of the more metal-y aspects on there. I think in my mind, this is their darkest album, at least thematically, maybe not musically, covering serial killers and what makes them tick. And this also sparked Porcupine Tree's fan base's fascination with trains, because every other thing is just like, oh, where is it going to tie into trains? And I don't know, I really enjoy this album, and I like it a lot more than some of their other albums, but I don't see quite as much of the love on this one as I do their subsequent follow-ups, because they're still very new in this metal arena. They're still very fresh, and I feel like they're like a kid that just has a basketball and they're just mastering how to dribble it.
I agree and I disagree. On the one hand, I think this is, in my opinion, I think this is their second best album. I think in terms of song structures, this is way more consistent than they would eventually be. I think this is the point where the lyrical concept surrounding the serial killers is a little bit more fleshed out and played more maturely, which I think is a good step for them. I think that I think the balance between the extreme darker points that this album gets, the big one that stands out to me is Creator Had a Master Tape, which is also one of my favorites from them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the places this album is willing to go with its very detached but murky morals is really interesting to me. I will say I hate some of the comparisons this album gets, which were a lot of Radiohead, a lot of Tool, and I'm like, no, stop.
I could at least, again, I don't agree with them, but I can see the case for like Stupid Dream and Lightbulb Sun for like Radiohead. It's like, okay, some of the same flavors, very different, but some of the same flavors. This, I don't see the comparison at all.
Well, the thing that drove me nuts is that it has a lot of that very ethereal sound. It was early 2000s again. This was also the era where Radiohead did their Hail to the Thief, and they were getting angrier too. Yeah. Not well. The thing that drives me nuts is the Tool comparison, because I'm not a Tool fan much at all. And the thing I describe as why is because I find a lot of their songs rigid. They aren't, and when they're not, there's an immaturity to them that I've never been able to really appreciate. I find their stuff is just wildly uneven. And while I think there is one album later on where I think the comparison makes a bit more sense, this one I don't agree with. I think that it's smarter. I think that it's better balanced. Again, the production's fantastic. Like, this is another where I think that the grooves are better balanced. I don't like Gavin's drums as much as Chris Maitland's, but that's me. And it works for what this is. There's a couple, what was the song? Third or fourth in to the runtime.
Lips of Ashes, Sound of Music.
Sound of Music, I really liked.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, again, it's that contempt that Steven Wilson has for the record industry, but played a little better, in my opinion.
Yeah. In my mind, this is like Four Chords That Changed the World 2.0.
It is.
In that sense. I both love and I'm not a big fan of the structure of this album, because I feel like the first 8 tracks, and it's interesting that you say the Creator Has a Master Tape was one of your favorites. Like everything from Blackest Eye all the way up to like point 3, I feel has like a beautiful flow to it.
Yeah.
And when we get to Creator Has a Master Tape, I love the track, but it feels like a sore thumb in terms of the playthrough. And I'm still not a big fan of like Heart Attack in the Lay-By and Strip the Soul, but I feel
I like Strip the Soul a lot.
I don't know. I'm not a big fan. I feel like both Strip the Soul and Creator Has Master Tape are kind of doing the same things that some of the heavier parts from Blackest Eye and Gravity Eyelids were doing. But I will say Collapse Light into Earth is probably my favorite track from Porcupine Tree. And is kind of like the road work for what Steven would be doing with later tracks like The Raven That Refused to Sing.
So in other words, I think this is the sort of album that I think it feels very transitional to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree to that.
But at the same time, it's not a bad transition either. Like,
no, I like, it's a transitional album the same way that like Stupid Dream or Signify were transitional albums in that sense. This would be the first album that I wouldn't feel bad putting in an S category, because even though those tracks that don't hit me all that well, I can still see what they were doing. I think that they did it very, very well. And I can't see anything that they could improve upon based on the concept that they were setting down from the beginning.
Yeah, I would be comfortable putting this in an S tier. Again, I adore large chunks of this. This was, again, I think this is my entry point to Porcupine Tree. I think it's aged pretty well too, which is actually saying a lot when it comes to a lot of early 2000s prog metal.
I agree.
Which I think has aged very poorly, especially in production. And this hasn't, which I'll give Steven Wilson a lot of credit for that. So great.
Oh, he is really, really good behind the scenes in terms of production for sure. And I mean, part of the reason why this also gets a very like high elevation is I have a lot of very fond memories of being up in Muskoka at night, just on the dock being surrounded by wilderness and thinking about serial killers. So, yeah. But speaking of wilderness, let's
Oh boy.
go to now. I feel like there's some really interesting thoughts from you on this one based on what you were saying, like just your reaction to this one.
I think Deadwing is Porcupine Tree's worst album.
Interesting. Okay, please elaborate.
Oh Jesus, this is one of those albums that part of this is not the album's fault. I think this is the project that I mostly found piecemeal. Like I didn't listen to all of it at once as often as I tried to. It was kind of a project that I found in pieces on LimeWire and early torrent sites. I had a hard time getting a hard copy of it. For a long time, I didn't think this album existed. Like I was like, I thought it was constructed out of EPs and stuff like that, and like a bunch of songs were poorly labeled. So I didn't get the full experience of this album until like the early 2010s. And then I sat down to listen to it, and outside of Lazarus, which I think is great,
beautiful.
I think this album this was the first album where I'm like, okay, I hear the Tool comparison now, and I'm not on board. Because I find the grooves so repetitive. I find the guitar work very clunky. I find the album very whiplash in terms of its transitions. I don't think it flows well at all. It's this, and the lyricism. I talked about this earlier when it came to maturity with Steven Wilson. This is the album that feels the least mature, even coming off of the debut. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, why? Like, I understand if you're trying to chase a sound. To me, it feels like it's chasing a sound. It feels like it was chasing the mid 2000s prog metal sound, and it feels like Steven Wilson was doing what he felt like he had to do, and that drives me nuts.
Yeah, there was like this shift in the later 2000s where a lot of prog bands went from this very symphonic, very big, very like symphonic sound to a much more stripped down, heavy sound. And this was happening just prior / during that big transition. I know like the background to this album was like Steven Wilson and this other individual basically wrote a screenplay and decided to make a soundtrack for it. And that's what this album is. So I agree that it's chasing a sound, but I think it's chasing a sound to a movie that never was produced. And because of that, a lot of the sounds from the mid 2000s are found on there. You know, because I can only speculate. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but they're like, oh, this song or sound would work good in this scene, and this song or sound would work good in this scene. I 100% agree with you that the flow of this album is all over the place. I think this is the biggest weakness. When I first picked this album up, I would listen to this again, falling asleep, but I would start right after Arriving Somewhere But Not Here. I would start the album on Mellotron Scratch, listen to that half of the album, and then start after Glass Arm Shattering into Deadwing. So if this was like on a cassette or an album, I would start at midway point, and it flows a lot better listening to it that way. Because a lot of the transitions, like going from Swallow into Lazarus and then into Halo, and then having Lazarus into Halo again doesn't work. But Lazarus is a brilliant song, and I'm not a big fan of Shallow or Halo. I think they're some of the weakest tracks. I do like some of what's going on here. Like I still love Arriving Somewhere But Not Here. It's one of their, for me, it's clunky, but it's one of their better tracks. I do also like the start of Something Beautiful, but man, they take a lot of time to get where they need to go. And I still don't feel as though they actually got where they wanted to go in that track.
And that's one thing I want to highlight is that as much as I like that period between 97 and 2002, where there were longer extended pieces within Porcupine Tree's albums, like, and not even counting the instrumental stuff, where you'd have songs like Russia on Ice, which would go on for a long time. It's like 13 minutes long. But they felt like they flowed better within the concept of the album. This is when Deadwing, the biggest mark I have against it is that when it drags, it's in weird spots.
Yeah, I agree. arriving somewhere but not here is in the wrong place. Like it shouldn't be at the halfway point.
Yeah.
Like they would do something similar in the next album that works, but here it doesn't. And yeah, I think individual songs I enjoy, but as an overall album, it does have its blemishes. I still return to it quite regularly because it was one of the first albums that I heard from them. But even with that, I can see, well, I don't love this as much as I know a lot of people love this album.
Yeah.
But I don't hate it as much as I know a lot of other people don't.
And I want to stress, I don't hate this album. I think it's, again, for me, it's a D tier album. But
okay.
at the same time, it's not a bad, like it's not bad. I don't think Porcupine Tree have a bad album. There is still moments here I will go back to, but I agree with you that it feels more like a score to something than it does a fully conceived cohesive piece. And I think that that's what kind of holds it back for me. And it kind of makes sense why I viewed this as so much of a piecemeal experience, because even when you go back to the album itself feels like a piecemeal experience.
Yeah, and I agree to that. Even as somebody that enjoys this, it is very piecemeal. It's very mixed grab bag. I think, I feel like your enjoyment of this album is mirrored by my enjoyment of like Signify.
Yeah.
So I don't mind putting this somewhere between like the B side of things.
I'm okay with that. Like
you're okay with that?
B or C, either one is fine with me.
All right. Yeah, I don't feel as though it's quite on the same level as C, but yeah, I feel okay with B.
Yep. Okay.
All right. Now this is the one for me that started it all, and I know this is the one for many. It's either this one or In Absentia, or In Abs, however you want to pronounce it. That is like the defining magnum opus for Porcupine Tree.
Well, this got them Grammy nominations.
It did. This was the first one that got the Stephen Wilson Grammy noms. I still don't know if he has actually won a Grammy.
I don't think he did for this. I could be wrong. Please correct me in the comments otherwise. But I will say this, it kind of earned it.
It did. Yeah. I feel like that metal aspect that they were going for, I think Stephen having a lot more time with Opeth and Michael Eckefelt and working very closely with him and both learning from one another, I think paid off very much. I know Michael loves this album. This is one of his favorite albums. And for me, it's one of my favorite all-time albums. This is one of the few times where I feel having the big long track in the middle of the album works, because a lot of albums in that late 2000s, early 2010s were trying this, putting the big show-stopping, 15 to 20-minute track in the center of the album. All of them didn't really work except for this one. This one, it 100% works.
I would agree. I think this is one of those albums that actually is better balanced in terms of its metal elements. I think they're better produced. There's I think there's the element that he leans back into more of a sense of melody that really helps this album flow. In a way, I actually view this kind of as a bit of a sequel to Lightbulb Sun in terms of that it takes similar environmental themes that were built on that, and it still has that same deep felt sense of melancholia, but this is a much angrier album and that the anger is better balanced, which I really appreciated. The flow is excellent. The one thing I will critique here is the lyrics.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, there's some lyrics on here that even I have to kind of shake my head to.
Stephen Wilson discovered the internet exists, and man, he's not a fan of it.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Like, and that's one of the themes that I really do appreciate about this album is like our relationship with technology and our relationship with the internet, and what it's basically like being connected virtually, but not being connected in a physical space.
And it carries that similar sense of similar themes and subtext on Lightbulb Sun of detachment.
Absolutely.
And I think when Stephen Wilson's at arm's length with his emotions, it often leads to very interesting results.
Yes. Yeah. And when he's actually engaged with his emotions, it leads to less than great sometimes.
Depends. I think it's less consistent.
That's a good way to put it. Yes, for sure. Yeah, this album has one of my other favorite tracks, like the final track of Sleep Together, I think is
Oh,
just,
so good. So
it's
beautiful.
so beautiful and so good. And every time I hear it live, yeah, I get very emotional. I also love when this album is paired with the EP of No Recurring, because I have this on vinyl and they intermix part of the songs from that EP into the album proper. And
Oh,
then
okay.
the final side is the rest of the songs from Neil Recurring, because they were all recorded at pretty much the same time and they use a lot of the themes interchangeably.
Uh-huh.
So I almost feel like if those two were released as I have it on my vinyl, um, it would have been, well, it would have been even better than what it is right now.
The one thing I
Um,
also find very interesting about this is that it's in comparison with a lot of Steven Wilson albums, it's relatively short.
it
It's
is,
like
yeah.
it's a 50-minute listen. It goes down quick.
Mhm.
Which is one thing I actually think that why that longer track in the very middle doesn't feel as bloated. It doesn't like bloat the album because it
Yeah.
actually does move at a pretty solid clip.
Yeah, and it's essentially three tracks that just don't have a space between them. Like
Right.
there's three very distinct movements in there, and I think that works to its full advantage. Yeah, I love this album. For me, this is top tier. This is an absolute S tier for me.
For me, it's closer to an A tier, but I would put this in an S. Yeah,
Yeah,
I get why.
part of the reason why I think this one is put in an S above a lot of the other ones is how many new fans they garnered with this album.
I would agree with that, and I think it's an easier album to introduce people to. Like I adore Lightbulb Sun, but again, I'll say it again: you can't introduce people to with that album.
Yes. Yeah. So let's move on to, until I guess in a couple weeks, their last work,
Yeah. So a
which
little
is
context here. This is where Stephen Wilson started doing his solo work. He was always off and on so many different side projects throughout the course of Porcupine Tree's run.
yeah.
But did Insurgents come out before or after this? I want to say
It came
before.
out. It came out before. Yeah, Insurgents was the album between Fear and The Incident, and then
Yeah,
he did The Incident, and then he did Grace for Drowning, and then called Porcupine Tree off.
right.
Yeah.
I have mixed opinions on this project.
So do I'll let you take the stage first.
Okay, so The Incident was one of those albums I came in with very high expectations. Like this was in my late teenage years. I was already into Porcupine Tree at that point very much. I wanted The Incident to be really great. And then I listened to it and I'm like, the funny thing is that as much as I don't think this album works with the bloated song in the middle, this is an example where it does not work. Um,
100%. Yep.
I think Time Flies is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Like it's one of those cases where the song itself works, but in the context of the album, it doesn't work at all. Because
Uh-huh.
and in my opinion, The Incident is one of those, it feels like an idea that got away from Stephen Wilson in the execution. I feel like it's one of those projects that has a lot of the scattered songs around the whole idea of the incident, the shock, the moment that will galvanize an idea. I feel like there needed to be more connective tissue to pull it together. I feel like this is an album that really needed that central unifying incident to be experienced by everyone in the scene. Um, Similar to how in some of his later solo work, he would have a little bit more connective tissue and build something and be more thematically cohesive.
Yeah.
But I think the larger problem with the incident is that, as beautiful as it often is, a lot of the individual songs are just okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I 100% agree with you that this is an idea that got away from them, and they really needed to rein it back in. Um, I do. I love the idea and the concept of this album, and that like it's one piece of music with a bonus disc, however you want to frame it.
God, don't listen to the bonus disc.
Well, it's
It's
interesting. I will say I actually enjoy the bonus disc. Some of the music on there. Don't listen to Bonnie the Cat. Wasn't a fan of that. He's trying to
nope.
channel some weird Trent Reznor stuff on it.
Yep.
Never liked it. But Black Dahlia and Remember Me Lover, I think you could listen to. Like those two I enjoy. But it's not essential.
Nope.
But yeah, I like the idea that this was supposed to be like one like 50-minute piece that's just divided. But once we get to Time Flies, it falls, like the track Time Flies, that falls apart, because we get to this single that's like almost 12 minutes long. That's in one hand, the precursor, or not the precursor, the continuation, the next step of those bigger tracks like Russia on Ice, or Arriving Somewhere But Not Here, but fully flushed out and realized.
Yes.
But again, much like Arriving Somewhere But Not Here, it's right smack dab in the middle of the album, and it displaces all momentum that all the preceding tracks had. That then brings us into this last third of the album, which is my favorite part of the album. But again, it doesn't, all the concept of what the incident was is now gone.
It feels like it was the sort, like, I think A Time Flies probably would work best as a closing track.
Agreed.
Like, I think you place that at the very end. You let I agree with you. The final third is better. I Drive the Hearse is fantastic. Like, there's a lot of songs that then you build into that final culminating moment with Time Flies. But where it's placed right now, it just, beautiful song, but it handicaps the flow so badly. It makes everything that comes after it feel superfluous, and it shouldn't.
Exactly. It caps the album off at the knees and then just leaves the rest of the album to flounder. And yeah, like, I love the instrumental of like 0 Degrees of Liberty and Octane Twisted. The Seance is so trippy and headspacey, and the Circle of Manas is so intense. It's like the hardest track that they've ever written. And like, if you had put that on like Opeth's Ghost Reservoirs, it would have fit very easily. But I don't know, it's so, Steven had such a clear idea, but didn't know how to articulate it, I think, on this album.
And that, unfortunately, I think would cascade into some of the solo albums. Like, Insurgents annoyed. Again, sort of my issue with Porcupine Tree. It depends how much I'm annoyed with Steven Wilson at the time, how my opinion kind of varies, goes up and down. Insurgents annoys the hell out of me, less because of the album and more because of the attached movie he made with it.
Yeah, he was really into, what's that, Harmony Korine, I think, is the filmmaker.
Harmony Korine, yeah.
That's it. And just tried to put that to music. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Well, he also then smashed a bunch of classic iPods.
I forgot about all that.
To make a point about audio compression. And I'm like, I want those classic iPods. You can't get them anymore.
Yeah, they discontinued the iPods. I want one of those guys.
No joke. I used to actually buy like the classic iPods on eBay, like third or fourth, like the third generations, where they were still 160 gigs in the hard drive, because that's the only way I could have all the music I wanted. And I know what he was trying to do, but it didn't work. And this was heading into a string of albums where that would be the case for him, until arguably The Raven That Refused to Sing.
Yeah, I fully agree. Like, I was just like, what on earth are you doing? Like, if you're trying to do that to send a message to Apple or the music industry, all that you're saying is, yeah, people will buy iPods if they're just going to smash them.
Yeah, it's not like you're making a good critique of capitalism there.
No, it's like the people that bought a whole bunch of albums just to destroy them. It's like, well, you're just churning the machine even more.
Yeah.
So
now to the incident.
Yeah, sorry, tangents. With the incident, like, I have a spotty record. Like, I love some of the music that's on it, but in terms of the actual album itself, it is a little bit of a mess. And yeah, I'm thinking anywhere between a C and a B for me on this one.
To me, this is more of a C tier.
I can see that. And like, I could listen to this one and Voyage 34 kind of in tandem, because they both have some of the same critiques that I have with one another.
Because again, they're both sprawling pieces that have interesting ideas, but the execution is not going to be for everybody.
Yeah, I fully agree to that. Yeah, and that's our list. That's all of them. I'm pretty satisfied with that.
I'm pretty satisfied with that too. I mean, for me, there's like Up the Downstairs, I probably put an A. Signify, I can argue putting an A. Dead Wings in D. But again,
that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I would probably put Lightbulb Sun a little bit lower. I might want to put up the downstairs a little bit lower, but I know that was our compromise, and I feel
Yeah.
okay with that. But yeah, I'm okay with all this.
Yeah, I am
Yeah,
too. It's a good spread.
cool. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for coming on and chatting about Porcupine Tree with me for a god awful amount of time.
No, not as long as I think both of us expected it would be.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, yeah. So where can people find you? I know we already promoted your channel once before, but we could do it again.
Sure. You can find me at Spectrum Pulse. I make lots of videos on YouTube. Also, my side channel, Billboard Breakdown, where I have my weekly series over there. You can also find me at social media, which is Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Spectrum Pulse. And also on Patreon, where I predominantly fund a lot of these weird offbeat shenanigans where if you want to get an album on my schedule, support the channel, or just join my Discord to yell at me more directly, there's the options.
And I'll leave most of those as all I can find down below in the description, so you don't have to hunt too far for those. And once again, I want to thank you, Mark, for coming on and chatting Porcupine Tree with me.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, Mark and Notes, we're out.
Cheers.